principales, Dr. Christoph Reimnitz, Structuring Director de General Electric del Reino Unido.
Hola y muchas gracias. Permiten que hablo con vosotros en inglés porque mi español no está suficiente para explicar todo el típico o el sujeto de el PG in power use. So for this, it's been incredibly inspiring to have heard the previous panel, and I have to rethink and give you a presentation that is tailored and fitted to what we've heard, because I think what may be of interest to you now is, what do we mean by LPG to power? What role can it play? What role can it play in Colombia? And I will hopefully give you a few thoughts on your way that will excite you, because I think the timing is right. We are not suggesting, and when I say we, I'm a hybrid of the working group, as Michael Kelly said earlier, of the World LPG Association, the Working Group for Power Generation, but also as an employee of General Electric. We're not suggesting that LPG is the wherewithal, but we think it is incredible, attractive supplement to the power challenges, the electricity challenges we have today. So I will be talking about renewable power. I will be talking a little bit about LPG as a domestic gas, and that one needs to use it and leverage the infrastructure that is available today in order to bring power and generate electricity from LPG. So with that introduction, I have a few points, and it was a wonderful video that was just shown because it really showed the basics. One of the points, I think in a political context, that is incredibly important to say is that LPG should, in the overall discussion, be considered a gas. While the name liquefied petroleum gas doesn't serve particularly well and potentially raises concerns, I think you want, from an environmental perspective, to pit LPG against natural gas and against liquefied natural gas, LNG. And I will be talking why LPG has so many advantages in certain circumstances over LNG. And the most important one is cost. I will talk about LPG for power generation is real. In the past, when I started on this journey with Michael and others, it was a concept that has been kicked around for some time. And although in Japan, LPG had been used in the previous century, at the end of the previous century, for power generation, it wasn't really commercialized. We see it now happening everywhere across the world. I'll give you a few examples. What is important is LPG logistics. And the logistics are important because my personal belief is that the power of the future is going to be less centralized power plants. So when we hear about the LNG import facility in Cartagena, or when we talk about coal-fired power plants that run baseload, you need big transmission grids to transport the power, and you will be losing a lot of energy and electricity. It's not efficient, it's not the way forward. And my background is I'm a German national, and Germany went through an electricity, or is in the process of going through an electricity transition. The centralized power plants are more and more a thing of the past. I think we're looking at power solutions that are smaller, adaptable, decentralized, and I think LPG can play a great role there. We've heard about LPG being a clean fuel. So again, it is all relative, and I think in two ways. One, I would like people to think, where can we exchange where today heavy fuel oil or diesel is being used for power generation? Where can I bring in LPG? Because there the environmental impact is the most obvious one and the quickest one. But I also would say that if we look at renewable power plants, these tend to work, and I look particularly at solar power, which is becoming incredibly cost efficient these days. But most countries, or many countries, do need a lot of power in the evening hours. They need it for heating, they need it for television, for cooking, for all sorts of things. And then suddenly you don't have any sunshine anymore. It would be heresy, in my view, it would be counterintuitive then to provide electricity that is based on diesel-generated power or HFO. That would destroy all the ecological benefit. So I think LPG in small portions is exactly the supplement that you need when you're thinking about renewables, when you're thinking about renewable in terms of solar or even wind power. So I will be talking and giving you an example how we're thinking about hybrid solutions. I think today still a lot of the renewable solutions, whether it is solar or it's wind, are not being sold as an integrated package. There's a huge opportunity, and it seems like from what I heard earlier that particularly Colombia is keen on thinking about how to implement certain things. And as we heard from Walt, I'm not going to dwell on that particularly long. There is, at least for the foreseeable future, a good outlook on LPG as it relates to LPG supply. So with that, this is a fairly crowded slide. What we heard in one of the questions here from our friend from Mexico was costs and economics. Today, LPG is fairly or is fairly attractive. And it is attractive for two reasons. One, because we have a lot of supply, particularly if you're based and if you're living in Central or Latin America. We're having a huge amount of supply coming from the United States, from the Gulf of Mexico. And we have, and this is more important, I think, again, in the scheme of things, we have infrastructure costs that are much, much lower than for LNG. LNG, on the face of it, if we talk about dollars per MMBTU British thermal unit, that's basically the pricing metrics for LNG. Yet on a like-for-like basis, by the time the fuel, the LNG or the LPG gets to the power plant, usually LPG has an advantage unless you go for a power plant that has 1,000 megawatts, i.e. a gigawatt or more. So it's all a question of scale, and I think it's all a question of energy mix and looking what is most suitable for whom at what point in time or for what kind of project. So I've spoken a little bit about the power. Therefore, LPG for me and for those I work with and who are interested in bringing LPG as an electricity source, we think the sweet spot is below 300 megawatts. Now one can have a conversation. Ideal is probably 100, because 100 megawatts of power, if you had it continuously, that would probably use about 100,000 tons of LPG, which is a lot. This country, Colombia today, imports about 50,000 tons a month. So just to give you some of the perspective and the size and the scale of what is needed. And so the new Cartagena import facility brings in an additional 4,000 tons of LPG at the moment per month. That is meant to go up to 8,000 tons. But what it does is it provides a huge opportunity to pinpoint and provide the feedstock for smaller plants, for smaller supporting plants, whether they're renewables or otherwise. The storage costs are, and again, if we look at the economics, much more attractive, particularly for these small to mid-sized projects, than anything that LNG has to offer. LNG, as the competitor here, is very expensive when you want to store it, because you have to keep it refrigerated at minus 162 degrees. And if you look at diesel, well, that may be available everywhere, but it has the environmental impact, it's noisy, and you usually have these facilities, these diesel engines mostly, near areas where you have dense population, so you're having a lot of health issues, as can be evidenced in certain places of the world. The other benefit is LPG to power is much, much faster. You usually, again, you in the room are familiar with this. This country, as I said, is importing 50,000 tons of LPG every month. So people are used to handling LPG, bringing it off a ship, bringing it from the storage facilities, from the cylinders, the big cigars, or the spheres, to the local distributors, etc. So there is a familiarity which one should use. And again, if you think about distribution centers, they're not all going to be in Cartagena. They'll go. Some of those will be within Colombia, inland, and combining the infrastructure, I think, has a huge potential here, and that gives an advantage of speed. And we mentioned and heard a lot about the environment earlier on. So I think it's not the wherewithal. LPG is not a substitute for what we have today, certainly not. It's a complementary fuel. That's how I would put it. But I think a country like Colombia can very much benefit from it. So I mentioned 3-4 years ago, we were talking about a lot of LPG to power being in a conceptual stage. Well, in the past, Japan has been the leader, and that got substituted for LNG because Japan is a big consumer of electricity. However, and they were using it to fire steam turbines that then generate heated up and used a steam generator. So a little bit of a convoluted process. Again, all of that in Japan was mostly replaced by LNG. But as we heard earlier, Ghana is actually a very interesting space. We have small gas turbines that exist, and I'm mentioning here some of our competitors that are operating near small mines in Ghana that are running on LPG today. So 2 of those are in the east or in the west of Ghana. GE is working, as we heard earlier from Walt, on a big project that is Ghana Tema, which is 5 large turbines of about 30 megawatts each that are coming online in a couple of months' time. So that has been a project that GE has supported tremendously, and it shows that you can also generate larger amounts of power, in this instance 56 megawatts in phase 1 using LPG. LPG in the US is being used as backup, and we have a bunch of engines, and I personally think engines are a great solution for LPG in combination with renewables. So we have in the US Virgin Islands 20 engines of Jenbacher, which used to be owned by GE, now is owned by a private equity company, the Jenbacher engines. But again, in a small island environment, very attractive. In Roatan, Honduras, our competitors, Wärtsilä, are running engines exclusively on LPG. And we have a number of smaller projects in Puerto Rico, Jamaica, and Hawaii. I should say that Puerto Rico, coincidentally, there is a hospital in the west of the island, and when Hurricane Maria struck, as most of you are probably familiar, Puerto Rico lost all its energy. Well, the one hospital that actually ran LPG-fired generators had continued access to electricity. They didn't lose power for a minute. So this is a great advertisement, again, because the LPG tanks are fairly heavy, robust, and were not impacted by the hurricane. So just one success story of why LPG can be superior to the grid, particularly for an institution like a hospital. Jumped here. I mentioned earlier the logistics are important to understand, and I've been trying to pit it here against LNG, because when we look at gas, it's either LNG or LPG. Well, yes and no. The process of getting LPG to shore is one, as I said before, that is actually already happening. Unloading LPG, storing it, trucking it, is something the LPG industry across the globe is familiar with, certainly here in this country. When you bring in LNG, you have to construct, over many years usually, big storage facilities. They have to be cooled. the cost of regasification. And once you've regasified liquefied natural gas, you can only transport it over short distances as compressed natural gas. So again, LPG here is a winner. There's no boil-off, and the process of handling of LPG is a lot easier. So here are just some of the examples from shipping all the way down to the local transport and storage, why LPG has a lot of advantages. And I think it's working with the government, with the institutions, educating, understanding how this works, building storage facilities. I've looked at the cost of building spheres across the globe from Sri Lanka all the way to Ghana and the US. It varies widely, but today there's much more experience in building these storage facilities and building them relatively fast at very competitive rates. And we can help you with that, and we can guide you and point you in the right direction. The one point I made, and I think it dovetails well into what we've heard here in the previous panel discussion, is LPG as a supporting fuel when you're dealing with renewables. So your typical solar farm may be anywhere between 10, 50 megawatts. And today, the metric is you need about 1 hectare, 2.5 acres of land in order to generate 1 megawatt. So there are land restrictions, and we heard from Brigitte that, you know, obviously land comes at a premium here. But when you look at a solar farm that has 10, 20 megawatts, which is sort of your average size around the globe, and you need backup power in the evenings or when the sun doesn't shine, I think an LPG engine-based solution is the perfect complement. You avoid destroying all the environmental benefit if you were using diesel gas, and you can bring it in a truck with a bullet on the back, your standard 20-foot container. That is fairly easy to handle. So I've given you here sort of the scale where it works. It helps you with the dispatch, and the emission levels are kept in bay, which you otherwise would not have. So it gives you the continuity of power that people are looking for. I won't dwell on this. We heard it from Walt. As of 2030 and beyond, LPG supply as we know it today, and again, these are all subject to revision, is likely to have less supply, or the growth is tapering off. One will have to see, and it is very difficult to predict who are the main beneficiaries. What I would say is, even if the global LPG pie that we have 300 million tons of LPG generation a year, of which a third, 100 million, is waterborne, is being shipped. Just imagine we just took about 10% of that, which would be 10 million tons. That would be enough to power 10 gigawatts of power. So I don't dazzle you too much with numbers. Colombia, for instance, today has 15 gigawatts of power installed. So I think there's a bit of breathing room, and by no means there's going to be a surge of LPG for power generation. I think this is a nice niche play, but everyone here in the room should familiarize themselves, and I think there's a great opportunity here. So in summary, and I'm coming to the end, the clock tells me I only have seconds left. I think the logistics, as I said, are relatively easy. CapEx, which is important from a financial perspective, looks attractive in comparison to if you pit it against liquefied natural gas, which is, I think, the clean power solution people would be looking at. There is a great advantage because of the ease of evacuation and the speed by which you can get to first power. So you don't have to design a mega project, but you can do something relatively quickly, put it on the ground, and use it as a reference project if you wish to do so here in Colombia. Otherwise, we can introduce you to people who are doing it elsewhere. The rental solutions available as well now these days, again, if you want it as temporary power, whether it is for a couple of years, 5 years, or 10 years, that is available. And the last thing I will leave you with is when we talk about LPG as a source for power, 70 to 80% of the cost of electricity is the feedstock. So one has to keep that in mind. So all of this will be driven by the cost of LPG. So how it compares to any other competing fuel that you're up against. So with that, I want to thank you for your attention. I hope I've triggered your interest in LPG to power. I would be more than excited to see Colombia spearheading it in Latin America, LPG to power, and I wish you a great conference for today and tomorrow. Thank you.